Hey guys! I'm recording this in the morning, so I may sound less tired. But don't let that prevent you from falling asleep in the middle of it, while I ramble on about my favorite story, A Song of Ice and Fire. This one will be about the chapter A Game of Thrones, Chapter 17, Bran 3. A commenter wanted me to do it, so I'm going to try to do it. In Grey Sheep and Hedge Wizards episode 4, I said that this will probably be the last chapter that I'm ever able to do justice. That's what I meant anyway. I don't remember exactly what I said. So you'll have to digest this episode with the understanding that I'm operating somewhat beyond my understanding of the story. This is actually a really short chapter. I think it's like 4 or 5 pages or something. But it's absolutely jam-packed with symbolism and foreshadowing and green dream and, well, the whole thing's a green dream, just about. Bran wakes up at the end, but that's it. And dreams are some of the most challenging things to interpret in this story. I think that's why I'm drawn to them. I like the challenge, and I'm symbolically inclined, I think. I think before I can even attempt to tackle this chapter, I have to tell you some things about the nature of A Song of Ice and Fire that you may already know or you may not believe. And so to some extent, you'll probably have to take my word on it. That the nature I'm describing is the nature of the story. And as with most things, I could be wrong about anything. At the same time, there are 5 books against which to estimate the resilience of an idea or set of ideas. And that's a lot of books. There's just like 5,000 pages or something. And it's also the majority of the series if there are only 2 books left, at least in book count, if not in page count. A big subject in A Song of Ice and Fire is symbolism, and more so as a personality trait within people. You can imagine that people have a built-in propensity for seeing symbolic meaning in things, regardless of whether that meaning is actually there or intended to be there. Catelyn is a great example of this. She sees symbolic meanings in things that aren't there. She reads too much into things sometimes. And that's one of the ways I can tell that the story is handling this subject of symbolism versus what I call asymbolism or anti-symbolism. I've kind of gone more towards the anti-symbolism of that. But it's a subject you see come up in discussions about the story all the time. For example, with my Winterfell dragon theory, I think the dragon over Winterfell was a real dragon. But there are a lot of readers who think it isn't. They think it's just smoke and flames and whatnot up in the sky. It's just a colorful description of smoke. And I can see why. Through a purely literal reading, that is what it appears to be. But then there's a part of me that factors in the fact that I'm reading a story, but also the fact that I'm reading a fantasy story, and that it was written by a guy who loves fantasy. So I sort of incorporate metatextuality in my interpretation automatically. I don't have to stop and try to do it. And there's some portion of readers to which that doesn't happen. In fact, the opposite happens, where I think if you present to them or suggest to them that there's more meaning going on here, there's more symbolism, they tend to reject it. Almost like they don't want there to be more meaning in it. Which seems kind of weird to me anyway, because then I wonder, why are you reading a fantasy story? Or any story if you're not trying to read deeper meanings into it. But maybe they are trying to read deeper meanings into it, and it's just that the deeper meaning they tend to read into it is that you shouldn't read deeper meanings into things. So anyway, this chapter, Bran 3, is about Bran discovering and accepting that the deeper meanings that he's seeing in the world, such as Greenside and magic and all this stuff, and warging, wolf dreams, is not imagined. It's actually there. And so you can see how that's a commentary on the discussions in the audience. where people are constantly arguing you're reading too much into it or you're reading too little into it. And what I gather from the story is that both sides are presented in a good light and in a bad light at times. And in order to get the truest interpretation, you have to reconcile the symbolic and the literal. That's sort of the preamble to how I look at this chapter and this story. And I didn't always look at it that way. I sort of developed this concept of theme over several years of thinking about this story. Because it comes up in, I think, every single prophecy, where there's a symbolic component and a literal component. I can see the symbolic personality types in the audience are blind to the literal interpretation, or at least the significance of it. And the same in reverse. The anti-symbolic personality types are blind to the symbolic interpretation and the significance of that. So the task of any would-be puzzle solver is to reconcile those two sides, which is absolutely fascinating, because it echoes the tension in real-world history between the religion and the state, the East and the West, and just on and on all the way to the bottom of philosophy. The chapter starts out with Bran falling. It seemed as though he had been falling for years. "Fly," a voice whispered in the darkness. So he's falling in the darkness, and there's a mysterious voice that's whispering to him. And Bran doesn't know how to fly. So immediately, the problem of the chapter that's introduced is that the voice wants him to fly, but he doesn't know how to. So this chapter is about Bran learning how to fly. In the dream, the flying is literal, but the implications of the dream for outside of the dream is not literal, it's symbolic, where fly can mean to self-actualize, to achieve your potential. So it's more a chapter about Bran self-actualizing than flying, or at least getting on the path to self-actualization. In the dream, Bran sees Maester Luwin throwing the boy of clay off of the roof. And this is a callback to a memory, which itself is a callback to a memory Bran had of this event literally happening. So this is a literal event that he's remembering, when Bran's parents and the Maester are trying to get him to stop climbing by showing him what happens when you fall. It's a funny memory because Bran is really stubborn about it. He kind of just laughs about it and says, but I never fall. Completely not taking the lesson. He's going to keep climbing no matter what they tell him. He's such a cool kid. I love Bran. But there's an irony here introduced of him saying he never falls and him falling. Well, maybe not introduced. I guess it was introduced when he fell. But it's referenced here. The irony's not lost on Bran here. You can see how that might make him even just a slight bit more bitter than he would have been about his injury. Because not only is he injured, he was wrong. But at the same time, he kind of wasn't wrong. Because, he fell, but it wasn't from his mistake. It was because he was pushed. But then you could say, well, maybe it was his mistake, just not a climbing-related mistake. Maybe the mistake was, you shouldn't have listened in on a conversation that was none of your business. Or maybe you shouldn't have stayed so long. Should have got out of there a little sooner. I love the next paragraph. It ends with, he would wake up in the instant before he hit the ground, he knew. You always woke up in the instant before you hit the ground. And so this reveals Bran's inclination towards symbolism, hypersymbolism. His understanding of dreams is so good that even in the dream, he's aware that he's not really in danger. The dream's going to end before I hit the ground. It always does, it's fine. Well, at least he's as fine with it as he can be, given that he's still falling to his death in it. And it's dark, and there's a creepy voice talking to him. And I think Bran knowing that it isn't real, that it's a dream, is preventing him from self-actualizing. And the Crow actually says something like this later on. He says every flight begins with a fall. And the idea there is that it isn't until you're confronted with the impact of hitting rock bottom that you're properly motivated to actually take the first scary steps toward self-actualization. Because they're scary, and as long as you're not scared of what'll happen if you don't take those steps, you're never going to take them. You're just going to sort of piddle around, waste your time, and cling to petty excuses for why you can't do it or why you shouldn't do it, or why it's a bad idea to do it. And like, the smarter you are, the more effectively you're going to be able to convince yourself that all of those excuses are not actually excuses, those are reasons with a capital R. So anyway, the Crow immediately challenges Bran's understanding of dreams. Bran thinks, you always woke up in the instant before you hit the ground. The voice asks, and if you don't? So he's trying to get Bran to think about, what if these dreams are more real than you're giving them credit? Which of course they are, because Bran's still at the stage where he thinks his wolf dreams are not real. He thinks they're just dreams. But he kind of suspects that they're real. Those dreams feel different to him than regular dreams. The ground was getting closer now. So in this paragraph, the ground's getting closer, but it's still really far away. It'll be a long time before he hits it. So it's like it's a threat in the distance that he could just ignore for now if he wanted to. But it's always going to be looming, like the ground's not going away. And every moment that passes, he knows it's just a little bit closer. And so this issue of learning to fly, he can't put it off forever. And he knows that. It was cold here in the darkness. There was no sun, no stars, only the ground below coming up to smash him in the gray mists. And the whispering voice, he wanted to cry. So it's total blackout darkness. There's no sun, there's no stars. Bran says, I can't fly, and the Crow says, how do you know? Have you ever tried? In that exchange, they're using different meaning. They're applying different meanings of the word fly. Bran's applying a literal meaning of, I can't fly like a bird. And the Crow is saying, what he means with fly is self-actualize. Because the Crow knows that the flying in the dream symbolizes self-actualization. So he's saying, how do you know you can't self-actualize? Have you ever tried to self-actualize? And I think he means really try, like, put your all into it. Like it's a life or death situation. And the answer to that's probably no. Because it's almost always no. Until there's a life or death situation. That's why that's what's happening in the dream. Bran asks him for help. The Crow says, I'm trying. Say, got any corn? So the corn thing, it stems from when Bran was climbing the tower. He remembers to himself that sometimes he brings corn to feed to the crows. And they really like it. And then when Bran falls from the tower, when he's pushed, he has another thought about the corn where he thinks he's sort of, perversely sympathetic to the crows. Even while he's plummeting to his death, he's thinking, oh no, I won't get to feed the crows. The crows aren't going to be happy about this or whatever. It's literally like the last line of the chapter, I think, of Bran 2, so. That's the genesis of the corn thing. And the corn thing actually continues through more books. Through Mormont's Raven. He's always saying corn. I'm not sure exactly what's all going on with that, but Bran feeding the crows is the genesis of it, and so whatever it means is seated in that. Bran reaches into his pocket and takes out the corn. The corn's just falling with him. The crow lands on his hand and starts eating it. So it's kind of funny. The crow has this distraction here. And so in a funny way, the crow is he seems not adequately serious about the situation. Or alternatively, preoccupied with the corn, or just eating. It's a little bit of comedy, I think. And it's an echo of the end of Bran 2, the chapter where he fell. Because the same sort of thing's going on there. With Bran's thoughts about not getting to feed the corn to the crows. It's like, really, this is what you're thinking when you're plummeting to your death? It's kind of heartbreaking, because it's his childhood is sort of coming out of yeah, it kind of does make sense for a kid to think of this. Because the kid is naive about death. And little things are bigger to kids. Kids are extremely authentic with their emotions. And so to see that come out in Bran's thoughts, it's a reminder of how young he is. And by extension, how extra tragic this fall is. This push. But there's also an element of how little nature itself cares about Bran, or just people in general. There's an element in that ending of nature doesn't care about people. It's kind of indifferent that way. And so all of those ideas are sort of coming together at the end of that chapter to say something about the relationship between them that I'm not able to articulate yet, but that's the kind of thing I really like to chew on. Maybe I will some other time. Bran asks the crow, "Are you really a crow?" "Are you really falling?" the crow asked back. "It's just a dream," Bran said. "Is it?" asked the crow. "I'll wake up when I hit the ground," Bran told the bird. "You'll die when you hit the ground," the crow said. It went back to eating corn. So there's the comedy again. But the crow is challenging Bran's attitude that dreams aren't real in any way. He's trying to get Bran to think about what the dream might mean symbolically for his life. But the crow never comes out and directly says, "Hey, this dream is about you self-actualizing." And so I think the crow doesn't want to do it for Bran. He wants Bran to do it for himself. Because I think by telling Bran that, you rob Bran of the wisdom of it. You never get as much out of something as you do when you had to do the thinking yourself, or the work yourself. And maybe there's an extent to which you can never get the maximum amount out of something unless you do it yourself. And so I think that wisdom is what the crow is acting on by not just coming out and telling Bran, "Hey, this is a dream about you self-actualizing." I think Mira does the same thing in Clash Bran 4, actually. Where at the end she tells him that you'll understand this dream in time. So she could just tell him what it means, but it wouldn't be the same as if he figures it out himself. Bran looks down and he starts to see the world coming into vision here. He sees snowy mountain peaks and rivers and woods. And he closes his eyes and just starts crying. The crow tells him that won't do any good. "I told you, the answer is flying, not crying. How hard can it be? I'm doing it." That's pretty straightforward. Crying doesn't improve the situation. And he's trying to encourage Bran by showing him that he can fly too. It reminds me of Piccolo and Gohan from Dragon Ball Z. Piccolo's sort of got Gohan out in the wilderness for survival training, and he tells him, "Crying won't save you. The next time you find time to whine, think about what you should do instead, and do it." Really harsh, but really true. But sometimes you just gotta let it out. "You have wings," Bran pointed out. "Maybe you do too." Bran felt along his shoulders, groping for feathers. "There are different kinds of wings," the crow said. Bran was staring at his arms, his legs. So Bran's looking for his wings in the dream, not understanding that the crow means these are symbolic wings. Because the dream is symbolic of you becoming the person you're supposed to be. Who the world needs you to be. And it may not be who you wanted to be at first. I mean, you wanted to be a knight at first. But in life, you don't always get to be what you wanted to be at first. And sometimes what you find, even you give it an honest chance, is that being something different than what you wanted to be at first is not so bad and actually can be really, really good. And actually, maybe you never would have unlocked that potential had you gone with your first option. Bran tries to remember if he'd always been so thin. And then a face swims up out of the grey mist. It's Jaime saying, "The things I do for love," which is what he said right before he pushed Bran. So Bran is just calling upon his memory here to try to remember his body, whether he was thin or not. But what comes up instead is Jaime. So that alludes to the idea that his injury and his trauma and the fall is something that is always in the back of his mind. It's intrusive. He can't even call upon his memory of a mundane issue about what his body was like before he was in a coma without the fall intruding. And it scares him. Bran just screams. The crow says, "Not that. Forget that. You do not need it now. Put it aside. Put it away." And it pecks at him. And Jaime's face is gone. It seems like the crow is trying to prevent Bran from stewing on his what happened to him and becoming resentful about it. But I think it's interesting that he says, "You do not need it now." Because it suggests that the crow, at least, believes that he will need that memory in the future. But right now, it's not doing him any good. And of course, that's sort of a standing question in the story ever since Bran's fall. How is Jaime pushing Bran gonna resolve? And I can see in Jaime's chapters late in the story that pushing Bran still emerges in his thoughts years afterwards. So I think it is going to come up again. Maybe they'll meet again. That would be a cool meeting to see again. Bran and Jaime. Bran says, "What are you doing to me? Teaching you how to fly? I can't fly. You're flying right now. I'm falling. Every flight begins with a fall. I'm afraid. Look down." So it's more of the same. It's more of the crow trying to encourage him to fly, and Bran not understanding the symbolism of the dream, and being afraid. So there's elements of you gotta face your fears. He's telling him to look down. He says, "I'm afraid." And he just screams at him. All caps. "Look down." You gotta look at the thing you're afraid of and face it head on. Because it's not going away. And Bran knows it's not going away. Because earlier his thoughts had a recognition about the ground's getting a little bit closer every moment. So when Bran looks down, he sees a whole bunch of visions. They're not really visions. What's so cool about this is that he's actually seeing the world as it is, in snapshot at this very moment that he's having the dream. He sees Robb in the yard training with a real sword. Before Bran fell, Robb wasn't allowed to train with the real sword. We saw that when the boys were sword fighting in the yard in that Arya chapter. It says Robb is taller and stronger than he remembered him. There's also a memory about his mom on a ship sailing across the Bight, which is also happening at the time of the dream. She's going south to King's Landing with the dagger. And Sir Roderick's even throwing up over the rail, which we learn about later on in a Catelyn chapter. He sees Sansa, he sees Arya, he sees Ned. These are all pretty straightforward. I don't want to go too in-depth with them. But there's one that's sort of prophetic. It says there are shadows all around them. Them being Sansa, Arya, and Ned. It says, one shadow was dark as ash, with the terrible face of a hound. Another was armored like the sun, golden and beautiful. Over them both loomed a giant in armor made of stone. But when he opened his visor, there was nothing inside but darkness and thick black blood. So this is one of the first prophecies in the story, if not the first. I guess it depends how you define prophecy, but I don't want to go too in-depth with that right now. I want to stick to the chapter. But remind me to come back to it someday. I have a lot to say about that. He lifted his eyes and saw clear across the narrow sea to the free cities. So he looks to Vice Dothrak, to Ashai. There's dragons over there, which is interesting because it means that Dany's dragons are not the only dragons in the world, which also aligns with the symbolic versus anti-symbolic argument about whether the dragon over Winterfell was real or not. Because part of the argument on the anti-symbolic side is that Dany's dragons are the only dragons. It's like, well, how do you explain these ones that Bran sees in Ashai? Especially considering that the other things he sees are literally happening at the very moment he sees them. Okay, so, can you tell which side of the argument I lean to? Okay, so, finally he looked north. He saw the wall shining like blue crystal and his bastard brother Jon sleeping alone in a cold bed. Yep. He looks into the heart of winter or whatever. And then the tears are burning on his cheeks. The crow says, now you know. Well, now you know why you must live. Which is interesting because it suggests that the crow thinks that Bran was depressed or suicidal or something. Which suggests that maybe he was. Bran says, why? He says, because winter is coming. The winter is coming thing. This is another one of those things you'll have to take for granted my interpretation of it. Because it would take a while to cite all the examples and stuff to evidence it. But in A Song of Ice and Fire, winter represents the hard times. Winter is symbolic of hard times in general. And they can be any kind of hard times. It's just hard times. And summer represents the good times. Things are easy. Everybody's getting along. Society's strong. All that stuff. And so, the phrase winter is coming means hard times are coming. And it's a statement that is actually always true. Even during the hard times. So, it's a warning to prepare for the hard times. Build your ark. Prepare for the flood. It's all the same idea. Bran looks down and there's nothing but snow and cold and death, a frozen wasteland where jagged blue-white spires of ice waited to embrace him. They flew up at him like spears, and he saw the bones of 1,000 other dreamers impaled upon their points. He was desperately afraid. Holy shit, right? So when he sees that, that's terrifying because that's what tells him that he's not the first one to fail this challenge to self-actualize. Look, there are thousands of them, like him, who fell like this and failed. And then he says, can a man still be brave if he's afraid? I'm sort of rushing to the end because I gotta go soon. But that's obviously it evokes Ned's quote about justice. In the conversation he had with Ned, Ned said it's the only time a man can be brave. So Bran musters his courage and he flies, suggesting that he's going to succeed in self-actualizing and filling whatever role remains to him after losing his mobility. And it's great. He loves flying. He finds it's actually amazing. And then the crow stabs his forehead with his beak. It opens his third eye. And opening your third eye means seeing through false narratives, I think. And this is another thing you're going to have to take my word on, but A Song of Ice and Fire has a very big false narrative running through it that I call them red herring themes. This story has red herrings at the level of theme. It's incredible. But when you see through the false narratives, you start to notice the story works kind of like an optical illusion, where if you stare at it long enough, you'll start to see a different image forming of the themes. So that's Bran's role in the story. To learn how to see through the false narratives, see through the bullshit, and I think deliver what he's learned to Westeros to save them. Then Bran wakes up and he gives his direwolf a name. He names him Summer. And summer's the good times. And that's Bran's role, is to usher in the good times by being the solution to the hard times, by seeing through the false narratives. And that's all I'm going to say on that for right now. Anyway, my time's up. I hope it was decent for you. See you next time.